Welcome to the RPTM podcast, the show that breaks down the myths of monolithic history and tells our story through multiple lenses. I'm your host, Professor Ryan Lancaster. Today's episode is partially underwritten by you, the listener. Find out ways to support the podcast on my website, ryanglancaster.com. Episode 4. Drugs, Sex, Human Sacrifice, and Columbus and his friends. Last episode I mentioned the two ways to really know a culture was through their food and their music. But there are other ways that are quite frankly a little more fun. Sex and drugs. The things a culture does in private gives us another chapter of the book of history that most historians often skip writing. And perhaps this is selfish, but I am just not that interested in the dogmas of religion and politics. It seems that we want to focus on historical figures and their grandiose policies and edicts, rather than what the everyday man or woman endured. So, our next rule of history: don't focus on the 1% of history. If you do, you'll only be looking at essentially elite white men, and we all know by now there are plenty of other stories to tell. Howard Zinn started this notion with bottom-up history in his work People's History of the United States, and has since evolved into the from the gutter up lens of history coined by Thaddeus Russell in his work Renegade's History of the United States. Buckle up. Keep your arms and legs in the podcast at all times. It's gonna get trippy. Drugs and Mesoamerican Culture. Drugs have and will always be ingrained in our culture. From hallucinogenic mushrooms and cacti to alcohol-infused enemas and psychoactive dried toad skins, the array of consciousness-altering substances that people used in early Americas was more extensive than thought. People living in Mesoamerica before the arrival of Europeans used such psychotropic drugs primarily in medicine and religious rituals. Moreover, some of these drugs are still used today for medicinal purposes in indigenous communities. Imbibing liquid is a popular high. The Maya, whose civilization reached its peak between 250 BCE and 900 CE, consumed an intoxicating drink called belche during a ritual in which they tried to communicate with spirits. The Maya made the drink by mixing an infusion from the bark of a plant together with honey produced by bees fed on a type of morning glory plant, which is thought to have psychedelic properties. In the ritual, intoxicated Mayan people aimed to communicate with spirits to predict the future, or to make sense of events that were difficult for them to accept and understand. Such activities included illness, changes in fortune, bad weather, poor harvests, and war. Drinking belche was also often accompanied by smoking tobacco and performing ritual enemas using substances that contain alcohol, sometimes mixed with other psychoactive substances. The enemas were applied using syringes made of gourd and clay, and they were performed to help people attain more intense trance states more quickly. Ingesting drugs is an easy way to get drugs into the system as well. Pre-Columbian Mesoamerican cultures used at least 54 hallucinogenic mushrooms, and those mushroom species can still be found today in Mexico. Religious practices involving the use of sacred mushrooms often took place in the Valley of Mexico and the rest of Central America. Researchers estimate that these rituals are at least 3,500 years old. Another source of intoxicating substances in Mesoamerican culture was peyote, a cactus containing more than 60 hallucinogenic compounds, including the primary one, mescaline. Mescaline is found within nodules of peyote cacti, which can be chewed or made into an infusion that people can drink. Ritual use of peyote in the Americas dates back more than 5,000 years to prehistoric times. Traces of the drug can be found in Mexico and the Shumla Cave in Texas. People who ingest peyote have reported colorful visual hallucinations of kaleidoscopic visions, a sensation of weightlessness, and altered perception of time and space. Both peyote and mushrooms disrupt the interaction of neurons and the neurotransmitters serotonin. Peyote can also cause increased body temperature and heart rate, uncoordinated movements, and profound sweating and flushing. One of the most unusual drugs in Mesoamerica was sourced from the toads in the Bufo genus. The salivary glands of the toad species in this genus produce toxic substances called bufotoxins, which also have psychoactive properties. Reports by 16th century historians say that the Maya added tobacco and the dried skins of a common toad to their alcoholic beverages to make the drink more potent. This gives you a pick-your-poison thing a whole new meaning. Tololoche is a type of plant called devil's herb and has been used for centuries in Mesoamerica to treat wounds and combat pain. But it was also used in rites of passage as a consciousness-altering drug during rituals. It has also been hypothesized that during ritual human sacrifices, some prisoners and those people that would be sacrificed were drunk with some consciousness-altering beverages, probably ones that were including tololoche. Sex in Mesoamerican culture. Sex means a lot to so many, and that stays constant in history. Gender roles in Mesoamerica were complementary, meaning that men and women had separate but equally essential functions in society. Evidence also suggests the existence of gender ambiguity and fluidity in pre-Columbian Mesoamerican civilizations. Gender relations and roles varied among different Mesoamerican cultures and communities through time and depending on social status. Although pre-Columbian Mesoamerican art contained depictions of the body as male or female, as represented by genitalia or secondary sex characteristics, it also included representation of bodies with exposed chests and waists but no visible sexual features. Depictions of ritual conducted by elite Mesoamericans have included women dressed in the traditional costume of men and men dressed in the traditional costume of women. Classic Maya text also includes situations where gender is not marked, or where gender is marked as male for a speaker who appears to be a woman, or vice versa. This evidence suggests considerable fluidity between the genders in some pre-Columbian Mesoamerican societies. Before all those taboos about sexuality arrived with the Spanish conquest and were spread through Christianity, pre-Columbian peoples understood sex as a natural part of humanity. It couldn't be anything but sacred. The unique sensation of reaching climax, pleasure, and the magical ability to bear the successors that would carry out your legacy generation after generation. Everything was surrounding the sexual act was shrouded with mysticism, and sex itself was mystical. Beyond simple penetration, the Aztecs, Mayans, and Inca were fascinated by the idea of creation through sex. So the act was conceived as something magical. They believed that just like the fertilized seed that can give birth to a new plant, female and male reproductive organs carried an undecipherable enigma. This life's mystery was always present in their cosmology. Various myths and traditions acknowledge how sexuality and masturbation were widespread practices in Latin America before the Spanish conquest. In the southern regions of Mexico and Central America, the Mayan people would carve wooden objects to masturbate with them. These masturbating rituals were a powerful custom in all of Central America. Their meaning was like that of sexuality in Aztec cosmology. The mystical aspect of sex was a cardinal point of all pre-Columbian civilizations. Not only did it represent their deep relationship with nature, it was also an element that maintained the natural order of everything. Sexuality, far from being a perversion or an offense against God, was a way for humanity to honor life. Human sacrifice in Mesoamerican culture. One more fun part about history: wholesale slaughter. There's something in our basal lizard brain that draws everyone towards violence. If you need any other proof, look at the Obsession with Murder podcast. Human sacrifice was collectively in many parts of Mesoamerica, so the rite was nothing new to Aztecs as they arrived at the Valley of Mexico, nor was it something unique to pre-Columbian Mexico. What distinguished Maya and Aztec human sacrifice was how it was embedded in everyday life and believed to be necessary. These cultures also notably sacrificed elements of their population to the gods. In 1521, Spanish explorers such as Hernán Cortés conquered the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, made observations, and wrote reports about the practice of human sacrifice. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who participated in Cortés' expedition, made frequent mention of human sacrifice in his memoir, True History of the Conquest of New Spain. There are several second-hand accounts of human sacrifices written by Spanish friars that relate to the testimonies of native eyewitnesses. The literary accounts have been supported by archaeological research. Sacrifice was a common theme in the Aztec culture. In the Aztec legend of the Five Sons, all the gods sacrificed themselves so that humanity could live. Some years after the Spanish conquest of Mexico, the Franciscans' body confronted the remaining Aztec priesthood. It demanded, under threat of death, that they desist from this traditional practice. In this sense, human sacrifice was the highest level of an entire array of offerings through which the Aztecs sought to repay their debt to the gods. The Aztecs gladly parted with everything. Even the stage for human sacrifice, the massive temple pyramids, was an offering mound, crammed with the land's most exquisite art, treasure, and victims, then buried underneath for the deities. Additionally, animal sacrifice was a common practice, for which the Aztecs bred dogs, eagles, jaguars, and deer. The cult of Quetzalcoatl required the sacrifice of butterflies and hummingbirds. Self-sacrifice is also quite common. People would offer thorns tainted with their blood and provide blood from their tongues, earlobes, or genitals. Blood held a central place in Mesoamerican cultures. It is debated whether these rites functioned as a type of atonement for Aztec believers. Some scholars argue that the role of sacrifice was to assist the gods in maintaining the cosmos, and not as an act of appeasement. Human sacrifice rituals were performed at the appropriate times each month with the proper number of living bodies and other goods. These individuals were previously chosen to be sacrificed, as was the case for people embodying the gods themselves, or members of an enemy party which had been captured and prepared to be sacrificed. Even the Aztecs' enemies understood their role as sacrifices to the gods, since many also practiced the same type of religion. For many rites, the victims were expected to bless children, greet and cheer passerbys, hear people's petitions to the god, visit people in their homes, give discourses, and lead sacred songs, processions, and dances. Before and during the killing, priests and audiences gathered in the plaza below, stabbed, pierced, and bled themselves as auto-sacrifice. Hymns, whistles, spectacular costume dances, and percussive music was different phases of the rite. The body parts would then be disposed of, the viscera fed to the zoo animals, and the bleeding head was placed on display on the skull rack. When the consumption of individuals was involved, the warrior who captured the enemy was given the meaty limbs, while the most critical flesh, the stomach and chest, were offered to the gods. Other types of human sacrifice, which paid tribute to various deities, killed the victims differently. The victim could be shot with arrows, die in gladiatorial-style fighting, be sacrificed as a result of the Mesoamerican ball game, burned, flayed after being slaughtered, or drowned. Christopher Columbus. And then it all changed. At least that's what the history books generally tell us. Columbus means so much to so many, and much of his history makes him a figure that is messy, and complicated. He is depicted with either a halo or twirling his pencil-thin mustache as he cackles. Hero, villain. Columbus's early life is somewhat obscure, but scholars generally agree that he was born in the Republic of Genoa. He went to sea at a young age and traveled widely, as far north as the British Isles and as far south as Ghana. Though largely self-educated, Columbus was widely read in geography, astronomy, and history. He formulated a plan to seek a western sea passage to the East Indies, hoping to profit from the lucrative spice trade. The young navigator's logic was sound, but his math was faulty. He argued incorrectly that the circumference of the Earth was much smaller than his contemporaries believed it was. Accordingly, he found that the journey by boat from Europe to Asia should not only be possible, but comparatively easy via an as-yet undiscovered Northwest Passage. He presented his plans to officials in Portugal and England. Still, it was not until 1492 that he found a sympathetic audience: the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabel of Castile. Columbus wanted fame and fortune. Ferdinand and Isabella wanted the same, and the opportunity to export Catholicism to lands across the globe. Columbus, a devout Catholic, was equally enthusiastic about this possibility. On August 3, 1492, Columbus and his crew set sail from Spain in 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. On October 12, the ships made landfall, not in the East Indies, as Columbus assumed, but in one of the Bahamian islands, likely San Salvador. For months, Columbus sailed from island to island in what we now know is the Caribbean, looking for the pearls, precious stones, gold, silver, spices, and other objects and merchandise that he had promised to his Spanish patrons, but he did not find much. In January 1493, leaving several dozen men behind in a makeshift settlement on the present-day island of Haiti and Dominican Republic, he left for Spain. He kept a detailed diary during his first voyage. Christopher Columbus' journal was written between August 3, 1492 and November 6, 1492. He mentions everything from the wildlife he encountered, like dolphins and birds, to the weather, to the mood of his crew. More troublingly, it also recorded his initial impressions of the local people and his argument for why they should be enslaved. They brought us parrots and balls of cotton and spears and many other things, which they exchanged for the glass beads and the hawk's bell, he wrote. They willingly traded everything they owned. They were well built, with good bodies and handsome features. They do not bear arms, and do not know how them, for I showed them swords, and they took it by the edge and cut themselves out of ignorance. They have no iron. They would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want. Columbus gifted the journal to Isabella upon his return. Following his first voyage, Columbus was appointed Viceroy and Governor of the Indies under the terms of the Capitulation of Santa Fe. In practice, this primarily entailed the administration of the colonies on the island of Hispaniola, whose capital was established as Santo Domingo. By the end of his third voyage, Columbus was physically and mentally exhausted. His body was racked by arthritis. In October 1499, he sent 2 ships to Spain, asking the court of Spain to appoint a royal commissioner to help him govern. By this time, accusations of tyranny and incompetence on the part of Columbus had also reached the court. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand responded by removing Columbus from power and replacing him with Francisco de Bobadilla. Bobadilla, who ruled as governor from 1500 until he died in a storm in 1502, had also been tasked by the court with investigating the accusations of brutality made against Columbus. Arriving at Santo Domingo while Columbus was away during the exploration of his third voyage, Bobadilla was immediately met with complaints about all 3 Columbus brothers, Christopher, Bartolomeo, and Diego. Bobadilla reported to Spain that Columbus regularly used torture and mutilation to govern Hispaniola. The 48-page report, found in 2006 in the Spanish National Archives, contains testimonies from 23 people, including both enemies and supporters of Columbus, about the treatment of colonial subjects by Columbus and his brothers during their 7-year rule. According to the report, Columbus once punished a man found guilty by stealing corn by having his ears and nose cut off and then selling him into slavery. Testimony recorded in the report stated that Columbus congratulated his brother Bartolomeo on defending the family when the latter ordered a woman paraded naked through the streets and then had her tongue cut out for suggesting that Columbus was of lowly birth. The document also describes how Columbus put down native unrest and revolt. He first ordered a brutal crackdown in which many natives were killed, and then paraded their dismembered bodies through the streets to discourage further rebellion. Because of their gross misgovernance, Columbus and his brothers were arrested and imprisoned upon returning to Spain from their third voyage. They lingered in jail for 6 weeks before King Ferdinand ordered their release. Not long after, the king and queen summoned the Columbus brothers to the Alhambra Palace in Granada. There, the royal couple heard the brothers' plea, restored their freedom and wealth, and, after much persuasion, agreed to fund Columbus's fourth voyage. But the door was firmly shut on Columbus's role as a governor. In 1502, cleared of the most serious charges but stripped of his noble titles, the aging Columbus persuaded the Spanish crown to pay for one last trip across the Atlantic. This time, Columbus made it all the way to Panama, just miles from the Pacific Ocean, where he had to abandon 2 of his 4 ships after damage from storms and hostile natives. Empty-handed, the explorer returned to Spain, where he died in 1506. The debate over Columbus's legacy continues. He is widely revered in the centuries after his death. Still, public perception has fractured in recent decades. Scholars give more considerable attention to the harm committed under his governance, particularly the near extermination of the indigenous Taino population from mistreatment and European diseases. There's good evidence that Columbus's regime brutally subjugated and enslaved the Taino to aid the Spanish quest for gold. Some other allegations, such as tyrannical rule over the Spanish colonists, are murkier. A persistent smear campaign called the Black Legend makes the extent of Columbus's blame uncertain. Many landmarks and institutions in the Western Hemisphere bear his name, including the country of Colombia and the name Colombia, which is used as a personification for the United States and appears in many places named there. Columbus is a brave explorer that should be honored for his courage in crossing the ocean into the uncharted lands, but he should be absolutely reviled as soon as his boots landed in the New World. The Columbian Exchange. There are many things Columbus and other Europeans brought with them to the New World, the seen and the unseen. Millions of years ago, continental drift carried the Old World and New Worlds apart, splitting North and South America from Eurasia and Africa. That separation lasted so long that it fostered divergent evolution, such as the development of rattlesnakes on one side of the Atlantic and vipers on the other. After 1492, human voyagers in part reversed this tendency. The artificial reestablishment of connections through the commingling of Old and New World plants, animals, and bacteria is one of the most spectacular and significant ecological events of the past millennium. With the meaning of 2 worlds, animals, insects, plants were carried from one to the other, both deliberately and by chance, in what is called the Columbian Exchange. Sheep, pigs, horses, and cattle were all Old World animals introduced in contemporary Native Americans who never knew such animals. In the 16th century, Spaniards and other Europeans brought horses to Mexico. Some of the horses escaped and began to breed and increase their numbers in the wild. The early American horse had just been game for the earliest humans on the continent. It was hunted to extinction about 7000 BCE, just after the end of the last glacial period. Native Americans benefited from the reintroduction of horses. They adopted the use of the animal and began to change their culture in substantial ways, especially by extending their nomadic ranges for hunting. The reintroduction of the horse to North America had a profound impact on Native American culture. The tribes trained and used horses to ride and carry packs. The people fully incorporated the use of horses into their societies and expanded their territories. They used horses to take goods for exchange, while neighboring tribes to hunt game, especially bison, and to conduct wars and horse raids. While Europeans first touched the American shores, Old World crops such as wheat, barley, rice, and turnips had not traveled west across the Atlantic. New World crops such as maize, white potatoes, sweet potatoes, and manioc had not traveled east to Europe. In the Americas, there were no horses, sheep, cattle, or goats, all animals of Old World origin, except for the llama, alpaca, dog, a few fowl, and guinea pig. The New World had no equivalents to the domesticated animals associated with the Old World, nor did it have the pathogens related to the Old World's dense populations of humans and such associated creatures as chickens, cattle, black rats, and mosquitoes. Among these germs were those that carried smallpox, measles, chickenpox, influenza, malaria, and yellow fever. The Columbian exchange of crops affected both the Old World and the New. Amerindian plants that had crossed oceans, for example, maize to China and white potatoes to Ireland, had been stimulants to population growth in the Old World. The latter's crops and livestock have had much the same effect in the Americas. For example, wheat in Kansas and the Pampa, and beef cattle in Texas and Brazil. As might be expected, the Europeans who settled the east coast of the United States cultivated crop like wheat and apples, which they had brought with them. European weeds, which the colonists did not cultivate, and in fact preferred to uproot, also fared well in the New World. One of these, a plantain, was named Englishman's Foot by the Amerindians in New England and Virginia. They believed that it would only grow where the English had trodden and was never known before the English came to this territory. Thus, as they intentionally sowed Old World crop seeds, the European settlers unintentionally contaminating American fields with weed seeds. More importantly, they were stripping and burning forests, exposing the native minor flora to direct sunlight and the hooves and teeth of Old World livestock. Native flora could not tolerate the stress. The imported weeds could because they also had lived with large numbers of grazing animals for thousands of years. Cattle and horses were brought ashore in the early 1600s and found hospitable climate and terrain in North America. Horses arrived in Virginia as early as 1620 and in Massachusetts in 1629. Many wandered free with little more evidence of their connection to humanity than collars with a hook at the bottom to catch on fences. They tried to leap over them to get at crops. Barriers were not for keeping livestock in, but for keeping livestock out. Native American resistance to the Europeans was ineffective. Indigenous peoples suffered from white brutality, alcoholism, the killing and driving off of the game, and expropriation of farmland, but altogether these are insufficient to explain the degree of their defeat. The crucial factor was not people, plants, or animals, but germs. The history of the United States begins with Virginia and Massachusetts, and their accounts begin with epidemics of unidentified diseases. At the time of the abortive Virginia colony of Roanoke in the 1580s, the nearby Amerindians began to die quickly. The disease was so strange that they neither knew what it was nor how to cure it. When the Pilgrims settled at Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1620, they did so in a village and nearly cleared of American Indians by a recent epidemic on the coast. Thousands had died in a great plague not long since, and pity it was to see so many goodly fields so well seeded without a man to dress and manure the same. Smallpox was the worst and the most spectacular of the infectious diseases mowing down the Native Americans. The first recorded pandemic of the disease in British North America detonated among the Algonquin of Massachusetts in the early 1630s. William Bradford of Plymouth Plantation wrote that the victims fell down so generally of this disease as they were in the end not able to help one another, no, not to make a fire, nor fetch a little water to drink, nor any to bury the dead. Venereal syphilis has also been called American, but the accusation is far from proven. Even if we add all the Old World deaths blamed on American diseases together, including those ascribed to syphilis, the total insignificant compared to Native American losses to smallpox alone. The export of America's native animals had not revolutionized Old World agriculture or ecosystems as Europeans' animals' introduction into the New World did. America's gray squirrels and muskrats and a few others have established themselves east of the Atlantic and west of the Pacific, but they had not made much of a difference. Some of the America's domesticated animals are raised in the Old World, but turkeys have not displaced chickens and geese, and guinea pigs have proved useful in laboratories, but have not usurped rabbits in the butcher shop. Ponce de Leon and friends. Columbus is not the only explorer shrouded in myth and legend. The first confirmed landing in the continental U.S. was by a Spaniard, Juan Ponce de Leon, who landed in 1513 at a lush shore. He christened it La Florida. Within 3 decades of Ponce de Leon's landing, the Spanish became the first Europeans to reach the Appalachian Mountains, the Mississippi River, the Grand Canyon, and the Great Plains. Spanish ships sailed along the east coast, penetrating to present-day Bangor, Maine, and up to the Pacific coast as far as Oregon. Ponce de Leon may not have been the first European to reach Florida. At least one native that he encountered in Florida in 1513 could speak Spanish. Alternatively, the Spanish-speaking native could have been in contact with areas where Spanish settlements had already existed, and Ponce de Leon was indeed the discoverer. Florida probably was first sighted by Portuguese navigators, or perhaps by the Cabot sailing from England. Either way, it started appearing on maps as early as 1500. By 1510, its distinctive peninsular shape had emerged clearly on charts in Europe. Half a millennia ago, the Spanish explorer Juan Ponce de Leon departed Puerto Rico from the verdant island of Bimini, an uncharted island which is now in the Bahamas. He eventually landed instead in Florida, where he staked a claim for the Spanish crown and ensured himself a spot in the annals of history. As legend has it, and as scholars have maintained for centuries, Ponce was searching for the Fountain of Youth, a fabled wellspring thought to give everlasting life to those bathed in it or drank from it. But new scholarship contradicts the old fable and suggests that Ponce was interested not in longevity, but in political gain. No mention of the Fountain of Youth occurs in any known documents from Ponce's lifetime, including contracts and other official correspondence with the crown. Ponce's name did not become connected with the Fountain of Youth until many years after his death, and then only thanks to a Spanish court chronicler out to discredit him. Ponce never went anywhere near St. Augustine, the city where he is said to have discovered the Fountain of Youth. He was not an old man. That tale was concocted by Washington Irving more than 300 years later. Ponce was after gold, but Florida had none to be found. He left and might have never returned but for the news of that Cortez had found gold in Mexico. In 1521, Ponce, envious, vigorous, and avaricious, made the fatal mistake of trying his Florida luck again. Ponce himself was struck by an arrow. The wound wasn't severe, but the Spaniards were indifferent to sepsis as they were to alert to heresy. What if Ponce had returned to Spain with little vials that he claimed contained the elixir of immortality? He would have been transferred expeditiously into the hands of the Inquisition. Instead, he died of fever in Havana, having discovered nothing, founded nothing, and unfortunately, achieved nothing. Ponce was only the first dreamer to have Florida swallow up his ambitions. Arriving in 1539, Hernando de Soto wandered fruitlessly across the future southeast before dying mad and broke. He had squandered his fortune in gold looted from Peru. He did leave one legacy, his pigs, the ancestors of the feral pigs that today rummage around America in the millions. That account of his exploration you were taught in school was made up of a congressional commission in the 1930s. Alarmed at how Florida destroyed rather than created wealth, King Philip II banned further expeditions. As one royal report pointed out, Florida was too poor in resources, and her harbors too bared and shallow to permit practical settlement. That was until 1565 when Spanish spies discovered France had established a settlement near present-day Jacksonville. On the king's orders, a ruthless henchman named Pedro Menendez tore across the Atlantic and brutally massacred the French. It was Menendez who founded St. Augustine and established European rule for the first time in the future United States. Thanks to him, Florida became the place where our country's first slaughter of white men by white men took place. As we like to forget, America was forged in bloodshed. In 1540, Hernando de Soto undertook an extensive exploration of the present-day United States, developing expeditions in Georgia, the Carolinas, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and Louisiana. In the same year, Francisco Vázquez de Coronado led 2,000 Spaniards and Mexican Indians across today's Arizona-Mexico border. Coronado traveled as far as central Kansas, close to the exact geographic center of what is now the continental United States. He was the first European that saw the canyons of Colorado. Spaniards probed half of today's lower 48 states before the first English colonization attempt. The Spanish didn't just explore, they settled Santa Fe, New Mexico, which predates Jamestown, Virginia, and Plymouth Colony. When De Soto and his team set off again, they moved more northeast towards present-day Georgia. After this came what would become the Carolinas. They soon crossed the Appalachian Mountains into present-day Tennessee and traced the Tennessee River Valley. Finding no gold, they turned south, heading into present-day Alabama. They arrived at a town near present-day Mobile, where they fought with the natives. Afterward, they turned northwest out of Alabama and into present-day Mississippi. Here another battle took place in which the Spaniards fought off the natives. Soon after, they made camp and spent the winter in Mississippi. They continued several months later, and in May 1541, De Soto and his men came upon the Mississippi River. They built rafts and crossed the river. Hernando de Soto and his expedition became the first European to see and cross the mighty Mississippi River. Hernando de Soto's expedition was one of the most elaborate efforts made by the Spanish to explore North America's interior. De Soto and his men were the first to thoroughly examine most of the southern half of the modern United States. It is essential to note the unfortunate negative impact made by Spanish explorers. The indigenous peoples encountered by De Soto and his men were exposed to European diseases such as measles, smallpox, and chickenpox. They had no immunity, causing massive loss of life amongst the Native Americans. Nevertheless, De Soto's records and maps added to Europe's knowledge of the New World. They provided information on the practices and cultures of Native Americans before the arrival of Europeans. For most of the 16th century, the Spanish carved up the interior of the continental United States. Spanish claims to Alaska and the west coast of North America date to the Papal Bull of 1493 and the Treaty of Tordesillas. In 1513, this claim was reinforced by Spanish explorer Vasco Núñez de Balboa, the first European to sight the Pacific Ocean. He claimed all lands adjoining this ocean for the Spanish crown. Balboa came from the ranks of the lower nobility whose sons often sought their fortunes in the Indies. In 1500, he sailed on a voyage of exploration along the coast of present-day Colombia. Later, he settled in Hispaniola. Still, he did not prosper as a pioneer farmer. He had to escape his creditors by embarking as a stowaway on an expedition. Balboa eventually had organized a series of gold and slave hunting expeditions into the Indian chiefdoms of the area. His Indian policy combined the use of barter, every kind of force, including torture, to extract information, and the tactic of divide and conquer by forming alliances with certain tribes against others. The Indians were not formidable foes and often fled at the approach of the Spaniards. The Spanish arsenal included their terrible war dogs, sometimes used by Balboa as executioners to tear Indian victims to pieces. The Spaniards were told by Indians that the south lay a sea of province infinitely rich in gold, a reference to the Pacific and perhaps the Inca Empire. The conquest of that land, their informants declared, would require 1,000 men. Balboa hastened to send emissaries to Spain to request reinforcements. The news they brought created much excitement, and a large expedition was promptly organized. But Balboa was not given command. Charges brought against him by his enemies had turned King Ferdinand against him. As commander of the Armada and governor of Deleon, the king sent out the elderly, powerful nobleman Thaddeus. The expedition, numbering 2,000 persons, left Spain in April 1514. Meanwhile, Balboa, without waiting for reinforcements, had sailed on September 1st, 1513, from Santa Maria for Acla, at the narrowest part of the isthmus. Accompanied by 190 Spaniards and hundreds of Indian porters, he marched south across the isthmus through dense jungles, rivers, and swamps. On September 25th, 1513, standing silent upon a peak in Deleon, he sighted the Pacific. Some days later, he reached the Gulf of San Miguel's shore and took possession of the Mar del Sur and the adjacent lands for the King of Castile. Storms prevented a crossing to the Pearl Islands. Turning inland, Balboa penetrated almost to the site of present-day Panama City before returning across the isthmus to Santa Maria in January 1514. His letters, and those of a royal agent who had been sent to Deleon to prepare the grounds for the coming of Thaddeus, announcing the discovery of the South Sea, restored Balboa to royal favor. He was named governor of Mar del Sur and the province of Panama, but remained subject to the authorities of Thaddeus, who arrived in Deleon, now a crown colony, and renamed Castillo del Oro in June 1514. Relations between the two men were, from the first, troubled by the distrust and jealousy of the ailing, ill-natured Thaddeus towards the younger man. The first bishop of Deleon, Juan de Equevedo, sought to act as peacemaker and arrange a temporary reconciliation. In a turnabout, Thaddeus was proxy betrothed his daughter Maria in Spain to Balboa, and the underlying causes of friction remained. The suspicious Thaddeus pursued a torturous policy designed to frustrate Balboa at every turn. Still, he at last gave Balboa grudging permission to explore the South Sea. By dint of enormous effort, Balboa had a fleet of ships built and transported to pieces across the mountains to the Pacific shore, where he explored the Gulf of San Miguel. Meantime, the stream of charges of misconduct and incapacity leveled against Thaddeus by Balboa and others had finally convinced the crown of Thaddeus' unfitness to govern. News arrived in Deleon of his imminent replacement by a new governor who would be subject Thaddeus to judicial review of his conduct in office. Thaddeus doubtlessly feared that Balboa's presence and testimony would contribute to his total ruin and decided to get rid of his rival. Summoning home on the pretext that Thaddeus wished to discuss matters of common concern, Balboa was seized and charged with rebellion, high treason, and mistreatment of Indians, among other misdeeds. After a farcical trial presided over by Gaspar de Espinosa, Thaddeus as Chief Justice, Balboa was found guilty, condemned to death, and beheaded with 4 alleged accomplices in January 1519. Although Balboa suffered a premature death, his actions and deeds are remembered by history as the first European to cross America. You've been listening to the RPTM podcast. If you like what you hear, please rate us on whatever platform you're listening on. Join us again next week when we talk about the seen and unseen of U.S. history. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, for more information, check out the show notes on my website. The show was produced by me. Our editor is me. Written and researched by me. Music is Down South by Bliv Beats. I'm Ryan Lancaster, and this was the RPTM podcast.